The leaders of Ukraine and Russia meet for the first time. They'll be in Paris for a summit that aims to put an end to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So will the two leaders find a solution and chart a way forward? And what's at stake? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Halla Mohiedeen. Ukraine elected a president in April whose top priority was to end the conflict in the east. More than 13,000 people have been killed during the fighting there between the Ukrainian army and Russian-backed separatists. And now, for the first time since he came into office, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, French and German leaders are mediating the talks taking place in Paris on Monday. The so-called Normandy group last met to discuss ways to end the fighting more than 3 years ago. Well, President Zelenskyy is optimistic he can bring peace to eastern Ukraine, but his critics see him as a political novice and fear he might give away too much in his quest for peace. His opponents have been protesting ahead of the Paris meeting. Well, speaking during an appearance on Ukrainian television, this is what Zelenskyy had to say on his expectations from the summit.
I want to return with concrete things and concrete results. But we understand not everything will be achieved. The meeting itself is already a victory, because as you said, we unlocked a dialogue that hasn't existed since 2016, and it means there was no opportunity to talk about the end of the war. This is what I expect, what I'm looking for, and what I want to find so much.
Well, let's take a closer look at how we got here. It all began in 2013 when then-President Viktor Yanukovych rejected a trade deal with the EU and accepted a bailout from Moscow. That led to 3 months of protests and his eventual removal from office. In March 2014, relations between Russia and Ukraine worsened after Moscow annexed Crimea. Then fighting began between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists in the east. And in September of this year, Russia and Ukraine exchanged several dozen prisoners in a sign of easing tensions. Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us on Skype from Kiev is Oleksandr Shevchenko, Professor of Comparative Politics at Kiev Mohiedeen Academy in Moscow. Viktor Olyevich, lead analyst at the Moscow-based think tank Center for Actual Politics. And also on Skype from Yangon in Myanmar, Anna Matveyeva, a member of the Eurasia and Russia Research Group at King's College London. Welcome to you all. Let me start in Kiev with Oleksandr Shevchenko. These talks that will be taking place in Paris, do you see them as a positive step forward? And what would you say Ukraine is wanting from these talks?
Well, I think it's positive because previously for more than 2 years, Mr. Putin didn't want to have any talks with former president. So this time there were some steps on the ground. So basically, I think there could be a progress. The progress could be regarding disengagement of troops in certain areas and exchange of prisoners. If it happens, that would be good. But the question is, what concessions will Mr. Putin demand from Ukrainian side? Because we need to understand very clearly that for Putin, what is important, it's not Donbass, it's the whole Ukraine. Putin would like to influence Ukraine and to have control over Ukraine. So the question is what he will try to push forward. And if we are talking about further political measures which could be taken, we need to understand that according to the logic of Minsk agreements, first there should be security, there should be ceasefire, and ceasefire was proclaimed in September 2014, and still there's no ceasefire. There should be withdrawal of Russian troops, withdrawal of and disarmament of illegal military formations, and finally control over Ukrainian-Russian border, because 400 kilometers of Ukrainian-Russian border are not controlled neither by Ukraine nor by international observers. So basically Russia can do whatever it wants. So without security issues, it would be impossible to move towards political part of Minsk agreements. And that's why I'm skeptical about something more substantive than, technical issues of disengagement and exchange of prisoners.
Okay, let's get the view from Moscow now. Viktor Oyevich, what is Russia wanting from these talks?
Well, all conflicts end at some point, but there are still a number of issues around Donbass that are intractable at this point. There is the issue of amnesty that Ukraine would be expected to proclaim for various political figures and fighters and others in the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. There is the issue of Ukrainian parties participating in any type of elections that would be held in the future in those two republics, self-proclaimed republics. There is the issue of how they would be reintegrated, under what terms they would be reintegrated into Ukraine, and how that would be perceived both in Russia and in Ukraine. The question of concessions is quite important, not just for the Ukrainian president, for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but also for Putin and for Russia, because each side, each power in this conflict is interested in not giving up too much and not being seen as a losing party, and so in a sense, Russia, of course, is interested in the two people's republics remaining more centered towards the Russian interests, and the Ukraine is more interested in them being reintegrated completely into its political space. And that difference, that issue is still intractable at this point. I would agree with Mr. Haran that the expectations are not very high from this summit, but the very fact that it is being held is already that the dialogue is going to direct dialogue is going to take place between Putin and Zelensky is a positive step. In the last year of the previous Ukrainian president's administration of Poroshenko's rule, not only were there no direct contacts between Poroshenko and Putin in the last year of Poroshenko's rule, but there wasn't a single phone call between Poroshenko and Putin in the last year of Petro Poroshenko's cadence in office. So the very fact that the two presidents are going to be able to speak to each other is a positive element, and hopefully they could lay the groundwork at least for some future progress in next year.
Okay, well, these talks are being moderated by France and Germany. Anna Matveyeva, if I could ask you, what is Europe wanting to get from these talks? Because it seems, speaking to the gentlemen in Kiev and Moscow, expectations for any kind of way forwards are at rock bottom. What's Europe's angle in this?
Europe's angle is first that they want to make some kind of revival of the process and election of Zelensky, and his goodwill gestures and his kind of new posture provides this kind of opening. So I would say that this meeting is very important, because that would give a signal: do we go ahead with this format, or we quietly kind of sidetrack it? So that's important for Europe to get the sense of, is it going somewhere, or we just or is it stalled? The other thing is that Macron has not been part of the previous negotiations in the Normandy format. So he comes with some kind of renewed energy. With Merkel, that's different. She has been through and through the same thing. She has some sense of fatigue. She has been saying all the time sensible things which have not been taken up. German position has helped to negotiate Steinmeier formula. So if she is not coming there with that kind of wow optimism, that would be understandable. But they would, the European partners want to see basically, is it a viable process or is it a dead horse at the moment?
And, well, the evidence would appear to suggest right now that it doesn't appear very viable. Certainly, Emmanuel Macron has been suggesting that the time is to get closer to Russia, to pivot away from this adversarial approach. And he seems to be the key driver in bringing any progress on a European level. So Anna Matveyeva, do you think that Europe is preparing to step back from its rapprochement with Ukraine and start moving closer to Russia?
That would be too much of a grand design. We are looking now at something which is a moment. Can Zelensky and Putin do business together? That is not going to be groundbreaking. It's not going to resolve all the problems. It's a hot conflict. People are dying there. It is a very kind of still serious security situation. But that may be a make or break moment, because Macron is the only one among European leaders who has the drive, the energy, the imagination, also youth, has some parallels with Zelensky, in terms of both being new presidents, not coming with a huge political baggage, open to ideas, not being afraid. So that momentum is quite important. And either this momentum actually works on this stage or doesn't work. That's also to do with leadership skills. It's also to do that, do we want to move forward with this agenda, or Ukraine would be sliding down the radar screens of major European powers?
Well, let me ask you, Oleksandr Haran, how do you see things in terms of allies for Ukraine? Are you concerned that allies such as Emmanuel Macron in France, or indeed Donald Trump in the US, are turning away from steadfast support of Ukraine? Where do you see Ukraine's allies right now?
Actually, we'll see the result in several days, because there would be a EU meeting which will decide on continuation of the so-called sectoral sanctions against Russia, and these sectoral sanctions are connected with implementation of Minsk agreements. And from what I understand, these sanctions would be continued for next half a year. However, if we analyze the international situation is not very favorable for Ukraine, because Macron is making too much, pro-Russian statements to have business as usual with Russia. And he's not very experienced in this kind of negotiations, Normandy 4. Merkel is much more experienced, definitely. And by the way, I believe today there was a statement from Berlin that Ukraine has already done unilateral concessions in order to move forward the negotiations. And now it's time for Russia to make adequate concessions from the Russian side. Regarding Trump, definitely there is a scandal in the United States. So there is a Brexit process in the UK. So the attention of these countries is diverted to other issues, and it's not very good for moving forward in Normandy 4. One thing I would like to clarify, because my colleague from Moscow mentioned so-called People's Republic. We need to understand that there are no any People's republics. They are not in Minsk agreements. Minsk agreements is saying nothing about these artificial formations. These are just pro-Russian proxies. And this is very important to keep in mind. These People's Republic are not recognized by anybody, even by Russia. And again, they are not mentioned in Minsk agreements. So we need to understand that what we have right now in Ukraine, it's not domestic Ukrainian conflict. It's Ukrainian-Russian conflict, where the aim of Russia is to control the whole Ukraine. And again, let me stress, unfortunately, Russian troops, Russian generals and officers, they are in the occupied territory of Donbass.
Okay, let me put that to you, Viktor Olevich. How do you respond to that? Certainly, we have the strength of feeling from Oleksandr Haran with your use of these people's republics, the so-called people's republics. Do you accept that Russian soldiers, Russian troops are in there and these battles are in fact a proxy for Russia?
Well, first of all, the two so-called People's Republics are self-proclaimed. They are indeed not recognized by any sovereign state, including Russia, but at the same time, they do exist. They are facts on the ground at this point. Of course, they are supported by Russia in a number of ways, both in humanitarian support, there is political support for them. There are military technological technical support for them. So of course the two so-called People's Republics are facts on the ground, and yes, of course, they are very much tied to Russia. But at the same time, the vast majority of the population of these republics is native. The vast majority are not people who came over from Russia, and they are the people, the native population there is quite cognizant of the difficult position they have been put in by the events of the past 5 years, where their economic outlook is quite negative. They face a constant threat of resumption of conflict with the Ukrainian army, and of course a significant number of people from that section of Donbass, the two People's Republics, has migrated into Russia. Some have migrated into Ukraine proper, and of course the people that are left understand that this is a long-term issue and it's not going to be resolved very soon.
But in terms in terms of concessions, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm sorry to cut you off there, Viktor Olevich, but in terms of concessions, we have heard that Ukraine has made unilateral concessions. Would Russia be prepared to make some concessions as well in a bid to kickstart this process towards a peaceful resolution? One of the issues proposed has been holding elections in these two disputed regions. Would Russia be prepared to withdraw military infrastructure in these two regions, allow all the displaced people to come back and take part in these elections?
Well, first of all, there is also a question of what Europe is willing to do and how that is going to be received by Russia. So, for example, if there are concessions by both sides, including Russia, how is Brussels going to respond? How are those sectoral sanctions are going to be modified in order to make Moscow more accepting of that, more willing to make concessions? So it appears that Europe and, of course, the United States is not going to, in any case, whatever, even if Donbass is on its way to reintegration into Ukraine, all sanctions are not going to be removed because of the question of Crimea, which is not recognized by the West. So the question remains, what part of the sanctions are going to be changed or modified? Is that going to be acceptable for Moscow? How is that going to be perceived by Ukraine? And how is it going to reflect on the public opinion in Russia? Because, of course, in Russia for the past 5 years, the public opinion has been mostly on the side of the so-called People's Republics, on the side of the Russian-speaking people in the southeast of Ukraine. And if Russia makes too many concessions in the eyes of the Russian population, then it could also reflect on how the Russian population, the Russian voters view the current administrators of Russian foreign policy and the Russian president.
So just to check then, Russia is not prepared to make any concessions until these sanctions are lifted.
The biggest supporters of the president.
Right. So the sanctions are obviously...
It's a question of give and take.
And what's Russia giving?
It's a question of give and take. And well, if Russia would be, for example, willing to make moves on possible elections and getting Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian political parties to take part in free and fair elections in these areas, then that would be an obvious concession by Moscow. But of course, also Ukraine would have to move to make a concession amnesty, and amnesty the political figures, the fighters, and others who had participated in various activities in those republics. Because if these areas are to be reintegrated into Ukraine, then the people that live there have to feel secure, and they have to be sure that they are not going to be persecuted, and that they are not going to face some sort of retribution from Kiev.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We are in the dying minutes of this debate. If I could turn to you, Anna Matveyeva. You were wanting to respond to those points from Viktor Olovich.
Yes, if we look at the grand picture, Moscow thought that they already made quite a lot of substantial concessions, but they maintained that they were not recognized as such by Ukraine, first and foremost, and also by the international community. Just to give you a couple of examples, there was an offensive in Donbass going on in late August, early September 2014. The rebel forces, of course supported by Russian troops, were making really big advances. Putin put pressure on them to stop the offensive. First Minsk agreement was signed, which stopped fighting and opened the room for, fragile, unfair, but still some kind of peace. In the next few days, the first sanctions on Russia have been voted in. So that was the reward for what Moscow thought was a major concession for not taking more of Ukrainian territory. Secondly, all the time, Moscow has been trying to hold back the appetite of the rebel forces, which were quite unruly at the beginning and could have inflicted far more damage rather than what they have already done. Secondly, every concession can be always looked from the point of view, is glass full or is glass empty? Elections, yes, in principle, Moscow would agree for elections, but then you can put the kind of conditions for these elections which will eventually be raising the bar higher and higher, like return of the all displaced population, control over the border, this and that. So basically, if there is a goodwill to move on something tangible, they will find a formula. But right now, we are not talking about goodwill existing, and we're still trying to get to this place.
OK, we have 1 minute left. If I could get a one-word answer from all three of you, are you optimistic or pessimistic that we're on the right track?
Excuse me, really, I need to intervene. So first of all, I need to say that elections couldn't be done in the occupied areas. That's first thing. Second, I am a bit shocked maybe by what Anna was saying. The sanctions were introduced against Russia after MH17 was shot down by a Russian rocket and after Russia started intervention in the Donbass. And at the end of August 2014, Russia sent regular troops. So these sectoral sanctions were introduced. So I am not sure how can we talk about that Russia made concessions. Russia made concessions by sending regular troops to Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. That's why I am not very optimistic, because I think Mr. Putin actually, he doesn't want peace. He would like to reduce sanctions, but he doesn't want to stop the war, where Russia is an aggressor, unfortunately.
OK, and finally, Viktor Olevich, from you, optimistic or pessimistic of a solution?
It is likely that there will be a joint communique at the end of the summit, but at the same time, we should not expect any major progress from this event.
OK, and unfortunately, we are out of time on this discussion. I'd like to thank all of my guests, Oleksandr Shevchenko, Viktor Olevich and Anna Matyeva. Thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting the website, aljazeera.com, or head to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @Inside Story, and I'm @Halla Mohiedeen. For now, from me and the entire team in Doha, it's bye-bye.